In the fall of 1943, the United States War Department issued a field manual with a remarkably simple title, Bayonet. From its opening pages, the manual rejected the popular image of bayonet fighting as a graceful duel in which two skilled opponents traded elaborate thrusts and parries. The American soldier was taught something much more direct. The bayonet was an offensive weapon. Aggressiveness was essential. Hesitation, unnecessary movement, or an attempt to engage in complicated fencing could be fatal. If the first thrust failed, the soldier was expected to continue immediately. Knock the enemy's weapon aside, strike with the butt of the rifle, drive forward again, and deny the opponent even a second to recover. The manual did not promise that a few weeks of training would make an American infantryman unbeatable. Its purpose was much more practical. When the distance closed to only a few steps, the soldier could not afford to stop and wait for the enemy to act. He had to move first, move quickly, and move with determination. American instructors understood that gunfire alone was not always enough to force a stubborn defender out of cover. An enemy soldier could survive an artillery barrage inside a trench, basement, dugout, or concrete bunker. A machine gun crew might remain hidden until the shelling ended and then return to its weapon. In such cases, the final argument of the attack was the infantryman who went inside. But the army had prepared for an even more desperate situation. In June 1942, the War Department released another manual titled Unarmed Defense for the American Soldier. It considered circumstances that every armed man hoped to avoid. A rifle might be lost, damaged, trapped in a narrow space, or torn from the soldier's hands. An enemy might grab him before he could bring his weapon to bear. American troops were taught basic methods of escaping holds, breaking free from choking attacks, using strikes and throws, attacking vulnerable parts of the body, and defending themselves against a knife or heavy object. This was not an attempt to turn every American private into a martial arts expert. The manual itself recognized that many units would have limited training time. Instructors were encouraged to select a small number of useful techniques and repeat them until the movements became familiar. The goal was not mastery. It was to give the soldier a practical response during a few chaotic seconds. Taken together, these two official manuals show how seriously the United States Army treated the final stage of an assault. An American soldier was prepared for the possibility that his weapon might fail, his ammunition might run out, or the space around him might become so tight that his rifle was no longer simply a firearm. It became a heavy lever with a steel blade at one end and a solid wooden stock at the other. He was taught not to wait for perfect conditions. In a real fight, perfect conditions would never come. From a distance, a German soldier might see only a helmet moving behind an embankment or a figure pressed against the ground by machine gun fire. As long as dozens or hundreds of yards separated the two sides, the battle still followed the familiar rules of a firefight. A man could reload, shift his aim, call for mortar support, crawl toward another position, or take cover in a neighboring foxhole. But when the American infantry continued to advance, those rules began to change. First came the grenades. Then, through the smoke and flying earth, men appeared at the edge of the position. Rifles were fired at nearly point-blank range. Bayonets, rifle stocks, knives, entrenching tools, and sometimes bare hands came into play. At that moment, some defenders could lose their nerve. Not because German soldiers were incapable of fighting at close range. The German army had experienced non-commissioned officers, powerful machine guns, well-developed defensive methods, and soldiers who had already survived years of war. Many German units defended their positions stubbornly and counterattacked even after suffering heavy losses. But personal combat confronted a man with a different kind of fear. During a firefight, Distance and cover created at least the appearance of control. In a trench, basement, stairway, or narrow room, that distance disappeared. Decisions had to be made instantly. A soldier might know several techniques. He might understand how to use his bayonet and rifle butt. But knowledge meant little if fear stole the 1 second in which those techniques had to be used. Fear did not affect every man in the same way. One froze. Another stepped backward. A third fired too early and missed. A fourth continued doing exactly what he had been trained to do. For that reason, any American advantage at close range did not come from a secret technique or from the superior physical strength of every individual soldier. It could come from a system of training that tried to make forward movement the practiced response to danger. Hand-to-hand combat was far less common than fighting with firearms during World War II, but it was not a Hollywood invention. The battlefield was not made up only of wide-open plains where two armies could see each other from hundreds of yards away. In North Africa, soldiers occupied rocky trenches, gullies, and folds in the terrain. In Italy, defensive positions were built around stone farmhouses, ravines, embankments, caves, and ruined villages. In Normandy, nearly every field was surrounded by thick hedgerows growing from raised banks of earth. German soldiers could dig into those banks and place machine guns where they were almost invisible to the Americans approaching from the other side. In Aachen, the fighting moved through floors, basements, staircases, courtyards, and holes blasted through walls. In the Vosges Mountains and the Hürtgen Forest, patrols could suddenly encounter one another between the trees at little more than grenade range. For the defender, allowing the attackers to come closer could be an advantage. The shorter the range, the easier it was to hit a target with a rifle or machine gun. German troops could wait through an artillery barrage in deep cover, then return to their firing positions when the American infantry left its own protection. But this tactic carried a terrible risk. If the defensive fire failed to stop the assault, almost no time remained to make another decision. Within seconds, the Americans could be at the bunker entrance, on the edge of the trench, or against the next wall. A position could not be captured merely by firing at it. Artillery could destroy a roof, silence a machine gun, or force its crew to keep their heads down. Aircraft could devastate a city block. A tank could break open a wall or fire directly into an embrasure. But if armed men remained in the basement, someone still had to go down there and search it. Ground was not truly occupied until friendly infantry stood on it. Hand-to-hand combat also rarely resembled a long knife fight between two evenly matched opponents. More often, it was the final stage of a close-range action, lasting only a few confused and terrifying seconds. A grenade exploded behind a wall. One man rushed through an opening and fired. Another tried to turn his rifle, but the barrel struck the doorway. Someone grabbed the weapon. There was a blow from a rifle stock, a fall, a shouted warning, and another shot from only a few feet away. Sometimes a bayonet was used exactly as intended. Sometimes the sight of the blade, combined with a sudden determined charge, was enough to make a defender retreat or raise his hands. To understand where that determination came from, we have to leave the battlefields of Europe and enter an American training camp. The men arriving there had recently been farmers, factory workers, salesmen, truck drivers, teachers, clerks, or college students. Many had never handled a military rifle. Some were physically strong. Others were experiencing regular hard exercise for the first time in their lives. The army had only a limited amount of time to transform them into men who could do more than shoot accurately at a paper target. They had to be capable of moving forward while someone was shooting back. The process began by teaching the body to obey a demanding routine. Reveille, formation, running, calisthenics, marches with equipment, Obstacle courses. Repeated movement over rough ground. A recruit learned how to fall, rise again, crawl, maintain his balance in mud, and continue moving while exhausted. This was directly connected to close combat. A tired man thinks more slowly. A heavy rifle begins to pull his arms downward. His boots catch on wire, roots, rubble, and broken boards. Physical training was not simply a way of improving appearance or discipline. It was the foundation that allowed a soldier to keep acting during the final minutes of an assault. Then came the weapon. The recruit learned to disassemble and clean his rifle, clear malfunctions, reload, fire from different positions, and shift his aim from one target to another. But marksmanship was only one part of the process. On the bayonet course, he repeated a small number of movements again and again. The long thrust, a shorter thrust for confined spaces, a parry to the right or left, a blow with the rifle butt, a quick transition from one action to the next. There was no living enemy in front of him. Instead, there was a padded target, a straw-filled sack, or a dummy mounted on a wooden frame. Even so, the instructor demanded full speed, full force, and a loud battle cry. The shout was not merely for drama. It helped the recruit exhale, overcome tension, and connect physical movement with an aggressive impulse. He had to learn not to slow down or pull the rifle back just before reaching the target. With repetition, the movement became less unnatural. The bayonet manual emphasized that these actions had to become instinctive. A soldier was not expected to memorize a beautiful sequence. He had to move from a thrust to a parry or a blow depending on what appeared in front of him. Inside a narrow trench or thick forest, there might not be room for a full thrust. There, the rifle butt could be more useful than the blade. In dense brush, the rifle had to be held close to the body in preparation for a sudden encounter. On a bayonet course, recruits climbed over obstacles, changed direction, and attacked several targets in succession. The reason for this became clear in battle. The first action might not decide the fight. An opponent could step aside, block the rifle, or appear from another direction. The American soldier was therefore trained not to consider the action finished after a single thrust. He had to recover immediately, return the weapon to a ready position, and continue. A man who stopped moving became an easy target. Group action was equally important. American training recognized that a real fight was unlikely to become an honorable duel between two men. Two Americans might suddenly encounter one German soldier. A moment later, another German could arrive. The side that used a brief numerical advantage most quickly had the better chance of winning. If two Americans overwhelmed one opponent in a few seconds, they could immediately turn and help against the next. But if every soldier became absorbed in his own private struggle, the advantage of the squad disappeared. This is an important point. American close combat training was not separate from small unit tactics. The soldier with the bayonet was not supposed to seek personal glory. His job was to help his squad take the position. The man on his right might cover him with rifle fire. The man on his left might prepare a grenade. The automatic rifleman could keep the defenders' heads down. The moment an opening appeared, several men were expected to use it together. Unarmed defense for the American soldier addressed a different psychological danger. An armed man could suddenly feel helpless if his weapon became useless. The purpose of the training was to remove that feeling of complete helplessness. Even without his rifle, a soldier might still break a grip, disrupt his opponent's balance, strike, push him away, or survive long enough for a fellow soldier to intervene. The manual emphasized balance, the use of an opponent's movement against him, and the concentration of force against vulnerable areas. But the real value of the program was not the promise that an American could defeat any enemy with his bare hands. The Army knew that many units would not have time to cover the entire course. The practical solution was to teach a minimum number of useful responses: how to escape common holds, how to react to choking, and how to defend against a knife or club. 30 minutes of instruction could not create an expert, but it could give a frightened man one familiar response instead of complete panic. That was the difference between sport and military preparation. In a competition, a man knows when the contest begins. He can see the referee and understands the rules. Inside a ruined house, no one announced the start of the fight. An enemy could emerge from smoke, grab a soldier by his web gear, or swing a rifle stock before the American even understood what was happening. The soldier had to create enough space to regain his weapon or survive until a comrade came to help. Beauty and perfect form meant nothing. What mattered were the few seconds that allowed him to live and continue the mission. But striking a training dummy was one thing. Seeing a real man in front of you, holding his own rifle and understanding that there was nowhere left to retreat, was something entirely different. No manual could erase fear. American soldiers felt fear before attacks, during artillery barrages, and while entering unfamiliar buildings. Many heard for the first time the sharp impact of a bullet striking a wall beside their heads. Some became unable to move. Others acted too quickly and exposed themselves to fire. The courage of the American infantryman did not come from an absence of fear. It came from continuing to perform his duty while afraid. He rose when the order came. He ran toward the next hedgerow. He prepared a grenade. He covered his buddy. He entered the breach. Training did not eliminate normal human reactions, but it gave those reactions a direction. Instead of asking, "What do I do now?" the soldier had a simple answer already waiting in his memory. Move forward. Reach the next piece of cover. Support the next man. Deal with the next threat. The German army understood the importance of close combat as well. German infantrymen were also trained to use the bayonet, rifle butt, grenades, and short-range tactics. Their squads were built around powerful light machine guns, while riflemen protected and supplied those weapons. Experienced German units could establish interlocking fields of fire, shift their machine guns quickly, and launch counterattacks after the enemy had been caught in the open. It would therefore be wrong to portray a German soldier as helpless the moment an American came close. In Tunisia, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, and the forests of Germany, American units encountered determined resistance. German troops launched bayonet charges of their own, threw grenades into American positions, and entered American trenches. At times, it was the Americans who broke under pressure and pulled back. The result of a close fight depended on experience, exhaustion, surprise, numbers, terrain, leadership, and many other factors. But knowing a technique did not guarantee that a man would use it in time. The psychological position of attacker and defender could be very different. An American squad that had reached the final yards had already crossed open ground, survived defensive fire, and overcome obstacles. Its men were already moving. They could see their buddies beside them and understood the direction of the attack. A defender might have spent several minutes lying under bombardment, unable to see the approaching infantry, listening to explosions and wondering from which direction the Americans would appear. When American soldiers suddenly reached the flank or emerged behind the next wall, the defender had to shift instantly from passive survival to personal combat. That did not guarantee American superiority, but offensive training could give the Americans a psychological momentum. The final approach was not an accidental disaster for which they had no preparation. It was part of the mission. If German fire weakened for only a few seconds, the American squad tried to turn that pause into movement. If the defenders began to retreat, the attackers tried to prevent them from calmly establishing another position. The American infantryman was also dangerous at close range because of his weapons. The value of the M1 Garand was not simply its reputation. In close combat, its practical advantage was the speed at which a soldier could fire again. After pulling the trigger, he did not have to operate a bolt by hand before taking the next shot. He could keep watching the doorway, trench, or corner of the hedgerow and fire again almost immediately. When an enemy exposed himself for only a second, that mattered. But the rifle did not operate separately from the squad. An American rifle squad included a man carrying the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR. His job was to create enough fire to allow other men to move. Imagine a field in Normandy. A German machine gun is hidden at the far corner of a hedgerow. If every American rises at once and runs across the field, the machine gun will cut them down. Instead, the BAR and several rifles keep the gun crew under pressure. One or two men begin moving along the side of the field. Another prepares a grenade. When the German machine gun shifts its fire or falls silent for a moment, the assault group closes the distance. Submachine guns were useful in places where a long rifle was difficult to maneuver. Rooms, cellars, trenches, and dense woods. But they did not solve every problem. A short burst could empty a magazine quickly. Smoke could hide the target. The weapon could fail. Then the rifle became an impact weapon once again. The stock allowed a soldier to deliver a powerful blow without first drawing a knife. The bayonet extended the reach of the American infantryman and forced the defender to react even before the two men touched. A grenade was often the true beginning of hand-to-hand combat. It could be thrown into a trench, through a doorway or window, or over an earthen wall. The explosion did not always kill or disable every defender, but it could disorient them, force them down, and interrupt their fire. The Americans had to enter immediately after the blast, before the defenders recovered. If a soldier threw the grenade and remained outside waiting, the advantage disappeared. Fire, explosion, and movement had to become a single sequence. One of the clearest examples occurred on April 28, 1943, near Medjez El Bab in Tunisia. An attack by soldiers of the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment was stopped by German machine gun fire striking from the flank. Private Nicholas Mainu did not command a large group, and he did not carry a special weapon. He fixed his bayonet and advanced alone against the fortified position under machine gun and rifle fire. His action was extraordinary even by the standards of war. That is why it was later recognized with the Medal of Honor. Mainu entered the position, killed its defenders, and continued moving toward additional enemy emplacements until he was mortally wounded. His Medal of Honor citation emphasized that his courage restored the offensive spirit of his company and helped the advance continue. This episode should not be used to suggest that American soldiers regularly charged machine guns alone with bayonets. It became famous precisely because it was exceptional. Yet it demonstrates the logic behind American training. The machine gun was winning as long as it kept the attackers pinned to the ground. Mainu turned immobility into movement. The German soldiers at the position were no longer firing at a distant figure. They suddenly had to deal with a man who was still coming toward them. Their psychological position changed in an instant. Only moments earlier, they had controlled the field with their weapons. Now they had to defend their own trench at the length of a rifle. The fighting in Italy provided another lesson. Stone farmhouses around Anzio looked like ordinary rural buildings, but in battle they became small fortresses. Thick walls resisted shell fragments and rifle fire. German troops could place a machine gun in a window, shelter in a cellar during a bombardment, and return to the upper floor when the shelling ended. The official history of the campaign noted that the capture of almost every farmhouse became a separate operation. Tanks and tank destroyers could damage or suppress the building, but infantry still had to enter. Consider the typical mechanics of such an assault. A tank fires into a window. Stone fragments and dust cover the front of the building. Infantrymen press themselves against the outer wall because the courtyard is exposed to enemy fire. A grenade goes through the doorway. After the explosion, the first man enters. The second covers the staircase. A third watches the next room. The German defender may be downstairs, behind an interior wall, or inside an attached shed. From the outside, the farmhouse already looks destroyed. But the real fight is only beginning. At Anzio, German units sometimes approached American positions just as closely. Around the area known as the Caves in February 1944, German troops used ravines and folds in the ground to infiltrate toward the American lines. During one night attack, they came close enough to throw grenades toward an American battalion command post. The Americans had to call artillery fire almost on top of their own positions to break the assault. This incident matters because it demonstrates that fear in close combat did not belong to one army. When German assault troops closed the distance, American soldiers experienced the same pressure. They could hold only through discipline, supporting fire, and the ability to continue functioning in confusion. The question was not one of national character. The question was which side maintained the initiative during a particular minute and forced the other side to react. In the summer of 1944, American troops entered terrain that seemed almost designed for sudden encounters. The Normandy hedgerows were not neat rows of bushes. They were massive banks of earth covered in roots, trees, and thick vegetation. They divided the countryside into small enclosed fields. A defender could be only a few dozen yards away and remain invisible. German machine guns were often positioned near the corners of the fields so they could fire along the hedgerows. Mortars were registered on the likely openings and paths. A normal artillery barrage did not always destroy these positions. The earth banks absorbed fragments, and deep dugouts protected the men inside. When the bombardment ended, a German machine gun crew could return to its firing position. The Americans had to take one field after another. It was slow, exhausting combat. In some areas, the front might move forward only the width of a few pastures during an entire day. Near St. Lo, American units developed methods for coordinating infantry, tanks, and engineers. A tank or demolition charge opened a passage through the hedgerow. The tank's machine guns fired into the next field. BAR men and riflemen covered scouts moving along the flanks. Engineers placed explosives while infantry protected them. The order of these actions mattered. If a tank entered without infantry support, a German soldier with an anti-tank weapon could attack it from the side. If the infantry rose without suppressive fire, a machine gun could stop the entire assault. During the advance toward Hill 192, one American company was held up by a heavily defended area that the soldiers called the German Corner. Several men reached grenade range, but that alone was not enough. The situation changed when another group moved around the position from the east. Scouts advanced along the side hedgerows under cover from bars, machine guns, mortars, and tank-mounted weapons. When approximately 8 or 10 riflemen penetrated the defensive position, resistance collapsed, and a number of German soldiers surrendered. The bayonet may not have been the principal weapon in this action, yet it was exactly the kind of close fight that explains the fear of the final approach. The German position remained strong while the Americans were trapped in front of its fire. Once several riflemen entered the network of trenches and hedgerows, the defenders could no longer understand the entire situation. German supporting weapons could not safely fire into their own position. Americans appeared from the side. Grenades landed behind cover. Each German soldier had to decide whether to remain in his hole, withdraw, or surrender. During the attack on Gréville, an American company encountered German troops in trenches, and the battle became a close-range exchange of grenades. The village, considered one of the strongest points in the German line, fell faster than expected. The official account credited American firepower, but firepower did not enter the trenches by itself. It created the opportunity. Infantrymen then had to close the distance and use it. Normandy taught the Americans another brutal lesson. There was no single technique that could open every hedgerow position. Sometimes the answer was a tank. Sometimes it was a flanking movement. Sometimes it was a rifle grenade. At other times, several men crawled as close as the terrain allowed and then rushed forward. One principle remained constant. A German machine gun could not merely be forced to stop firing for a few seconds. It had to be prevented from firing again. That required someone to approach it. In the fall of 1944, the battle moved into Aachen. There, distances were measured not in fields, but in rooms. American artillery and aircraft could cause enormous destruction, but a ruined city created new defensive positions. A collapsed wall became a barricade. A cellar survived direct hits. German soldiers used courtyards, adjoining buildings, basements, and underground passages to appear in areas the Americans believed had already been cleared. American infantry tried to avoid open streets covered by fire from windows and intersections. Tanks and self-propelled guns shelled a building while riflemen approached. The supporting fire then shifted to the next structure. The bombardment often drove the defenders into cellars. American troops entered behind grenades, and every basement doorway could begin another fight. The official history of Aachen described grenade duels at cellar entrances. In such a place, the normal distinction between gunfire and hand-to-hand combat nearly disappeared. A soldier might fire through a doorway, strike a man behind it with the butt of his rifle, retreat from a grenade, and enter again seconds later. A room appeared empty until a defender came through a hole in the next wall. On a staircase, two men could not easily pass each other. A long rifle caught on a railing. The deafening crack of gunfire inside a stone corridor made it impossible to hear commands. Why might a German defender fear the moment Americans entered his building? Until then, he could still hope that the artillery would stop, that the tank would be unable to bring its gun to bear, or that the infantry would refuse to cross the courtyard. But when the first American grenade landed at the cellar door, the waiting ended. A man would be coming behind it, and that man had been trained not to stand in the doorway, but to keep moving until the resistance was overcome. American soldiers in Aachen were not invulnerable. They suffered heavy losses. They were fired upon from buildings that had supposedly been cleared. They became exhausted by the constant strain. A German soldier who knew the building could hold an important advantage, but the American method connected heavy weapons with the determination of small groups. First, a wall was broken open. Then machine guns covered the windows. After that, an infantryman entered the opening. That last step was both the most dangerous and the most necessary. A month later, in the Hürtgen Forest, the Americans fought in a completely different environment. But once again, the distance collapsed. Dense trees limited visibility. Mines, wire, and concealed bunkers separated units into small groups. Artillery shells exploded in the treetops and sent wood fragments across the ground. A soldier could easily lose his direction. A German position might be only a few trees away. On November 20th, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel George Mabry led the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Infantry Regiment through the Hürtgen Forest. The forward troops were stopped by a minefield under heavy fire. Mabry moved ahead personally, helped locate a passage, and then crossed a mined wire obstacle. Beyond it were German trenches and bunkers. He first forced 3 German soldiers to surrender at bayonet point. At the next position, he encountered a group of enemy troops moving toward him. According to his Medal of Honor citation, Mabry struck one man with his rifle butt and killed another with the bayonet. American scouts then arrived and helped overcome the remaining soldiers in close combat. The group went on to attack another bunker under fire at almost point-blank range and captured the men inside. Like the actions of Nicolas Menu, Mabry's behavior was extraordinary. It cannot be treated as a description of every American officer or every American private, but the episode shows how the different parts of training could come together in a real battle. Mines and wire stopped the advance. Bunkers protected the defenders. At the final distance, the long list of modern weapons gave way to the simplest tools: movement, a rifle, its stock, its bayonet, and the arrival of fellow soldiers. The support of those fellow soldiers was especially important. Mabry had moved ahead, but the fight did not remain an individual contest. The scouts joined as soon as they reached him. This reflected the logic of American close combat training: create a local numerical advantage, overwhelm the immediate threat, and continue moving. The German soldiers coming out of the bunker may have been just as determined. The result was decided by seconds, initiative, and which man's comrades entered the fight first. By the end of 1944, the German army remained an extremely dangerous opponent. During the Battle of the Bulge, it achieved surprise, broke through the American front, and surrounded several units. It would therefore be false to claim that German troops had generally lost the will to fight Americans at close range. Some German formations contained experienced veterans. Others were filled with replacements who had received limited training. Some defended until they were destroyed. Others surrendered after being outflanked. The same differences existed among American soldiers, but the United States Army possessed the advantage of a broad and organized system. A recruit went through physical conditioning, rifle training, grenade practice, small unit exercises, and bayonet instruction. He was introduced to the possibility of losing his weapon. He learned that supporting fire was not a reason to remain on the ground. It was an opportunity to move. The squad leader used BAR fire and rifle fire so that part of the unit could advance while the rest kept the enemy under pressure. As a result, the American infantryman became most dangerous not when he fought completely alone, but when he remained connected to the men around him. One soldier fired, a second moved, a third worked around the flank, a fourth prepared a grenade. At close range, this system could appear to a German defender as a series of threats arriving too quickly to answer. He turned toward one American and exposed himself to another. He left one trench and found a flanking group in his path. He rose after the explosion and saw another rifleman already at the entrance. The psychological pressure began before the bayonet appeared. The German soldier heard bursts from American automatic weapons and the rapid individual shots of semi-automatic rifles. Then the fire shifted. A grenade exploded. Voices came closer. If the Americans were still advancing after all of that, the defender understood that his fire had failed to stop the attack. The protection offered by distance was disappearing. Fear has a rational foundation. A man fears not only death, but the loss of control. At long range, a German soldier could watch a sector, choose a target, and respond to commands. In close combat, information fell apart. He did not know how many Americans had already crossed the hedgerow. He could not be sure whether the neighboring building had been cleared. He did not know whether the path behind him remained open. Every second demanded a new decision. American training can be understood as an attempt to produce the opposite condition. The American soldier did not have a complete picture either, but he had been given simple actions that still made sense inside chaos. Stay low, cover your buddy, throw the grenade, enter after the blast. Do not remain in the doorway. If the enemy blocks the bayonet, knock his weapon aside and continue. If he grabs the rifle, break free or fight long enough for another American to reach you. Simplicity mattered. A complicated technique requires space, correct positioning, and a clear mind. A trench offers none of those things. Clothing catches on earth and wood. Hands slip. Men shout. Smoke obscures the next threat. That is why American manuals reduced the number of choices. In a moment of danger, a man rarely becomes more creative. He returns to the actions he has practiced most often. Even the best training could not guarantee victory. There were attacks in which American infantry remained pinned down and could not move. There were buildings that had to be assaulted several times. There were German counterattacks that forced Americans to fight for their own trenches. There were moments when inexperienced replacements became confused, and units lost their organization after their officers and sergeants were killed. That is why respecting the American soldier does not require turning him into a superman. His achievement becomes greater when we remember the kind of enemy he faced and the conditions under which he fought. The German army knew how to defend. It possessed powerful machine guns, carefully prepared positions, mines, grenades, and a tradition of aggressive counterattack. The Americans did not have to defeat a helpless coward. They had to defeat an armed man who often had cover, combat experience, and orders to hold his position. Victory in the final yards came from the combination of many efforts. Artillerymen forced the enemy to take cover. Tanks destroyed firing ports and walls. Engineers opened passages. Machine gunners and riflemen suppressed defensive positions. Medics brought back the wounded and gave the men confidence that they would not be abandoned. Sergeants got soldiers moving and pointed them toward the next objective. But at the end of that chain stood the infantryman. He was the man who had to enter the place from which someone might still be shooting. To the German soldier, that infantryman could appear to represent the entire power of the United States. The defender could not see the artillery batteries behind the front, the repair units, the training camps, or the factories across the Atlantic. He saw only one man in a helmet carrying a rifle. But behind that man's movement stood months of preparation and the support of an entire squad. A bar was covering his advance. Another soldier waited behind the hedgerow with a grenade. A second rifleman could appear through the breach at any moment. For that reason, the statement that German soldiers feared hand-to-hand combat with Americans must be treated carefully. There is no document proving that every German soldier feared every American soldier. The emotions of an entire army cannot be measured by a single number. But something else can be said with confidence. The approach of determined infantry places enormous pressure on any defender. The United States Army deliberately prepared its soldiers to exploit that moment. Its manuals connected the bayonet with aggression, speed, initiative, and the effort to break the enemy's willingness to resist. The results can be seen in real battles. In Tunisia, one soldier with a bayonet helped transform a stalled attack into renewed movement. In Italy, every stone farmhouse ultimately had to be cleared by infantry. In Normandy, German strongpoints remained powerful while the Americans were trapped in front of them, but became far more vulnerable after infantry penetrated the trenches and hedgerows. In Aachen, heavy weapons opened walls, but men with rifles and grenades had to clear the basements. In the Hürtgen Forest, the fight around a bunker was decided by a rifle butt, a bayonet, and the arrival of American scouts. In all these cases, hand-to-hand combat was not separate from modern warfare. It was the final and most confined part of it. An artillery shell opened the wall. A machine gun created a few seconds of silence. A grenade forced the defender down. Then came the part that no machine could perform. The German soldier might not have feared the steel blade itself. He feared the sequence that was moving toward him. First, his position had been located. Then it had been suppressed. Then it had been outflanked. Now, through the smoke, came a man who had been taught not to consider the first shot, the first blow, or the first resistance the end of the attack. The American soldier was afraid too. His instincts told him to remain behind the wall and avoid the dark doorway. He thought about home, about his family, and about whether the war was nearly over or had barely begun. But his buddies were moving beside him, and the commands of his instructors remained in his memory. Courage was found in the next step. There was no secret American technique that guaranteed victory. Not every American infantryman was physically stronger than the German soldier facing him. Not every assault succeeded. The real danger came from a system that took an ordinary civilian, gave him a rifle, endurance, a handful of simple skills, and the habit of acting with other men. From a distance, the German defender saw one more figure advancing under fire. Inside a trench, a room, or a forest foxhole, he faced a man who had been taught that this was the one moment when hesitation could cost him everything. The final yards were not crossed by men without fear. They were crossed by men who kept moving,